Hey, St. John's. Thanks for being with us on this episode of Quarantine Q&A. With us today, we have Brenda Blackhawk. Brenda is a organizer at the Synod, and can you tell us a little bit more about what you do?
Yeah, so I am the Congregational Organizer for Racial Justice at the Minneaplis Area Synod. And my work kind of runs a little bit of the gamut in racial justice, but with a heavy focus on community organizing, congregational organizing specifically. So what that means is I do some work with congregations who are starting out on doing racial justice work within their congregations and in their communities, and I'll help them kind of get started on that and what that looks like. We kind of have a little bit of a step-by-step process to help congregations really start those hard conversations. But that's just a small piece of my work. Like I said, the bulk of my work is in organizing. And that's really where my heart kind of lies. So I have a couple different teams that work on different issues. One of my teams is working on anti-gentrification in North Minneapolis, which is a major racial justice issue. And then my other team, which you're actually a part of, Jerod, is called SOAR, Strategic Organizing Against Racism. And that team is working on voter reenfranchisement. So returning residents who have felonies on their records, generally speaking, aren't allowed to vote because of collateral sanctions. And so we want to make sure that all people, all citizens who work and are taxed and all those things have representation, and they need to be able to vote.
So for people who don't know, what is organizing and what does an organizer do?
Yeah, so organizing, we use the Midwest Academy's model for organizing. And Midwest Academy was established in the 70s, right after like the civil rights movement. So they had a lot of those people with experience in that who kind of created this model. And it's a very strategic model. So what we do is we spend a lot of time talking with leaders, community members, other folks, and kind of understanding what is people's passion, what do they care about, what is it that matters to them, and what are they worried about, those kinds of things. We identify those issues that matter to people, and we find the leaders who can lead on those issues, and we empower them and help develop them so that they can create legislative changes or lead community actions, those kinds of things to help create lasting change in people's lives.
That's awesome. Why would the Synod, of all things, be interested or involved in doing this work of organizing?
Right. Well, the Synod is, the ELCA organization here in Minneapolis that we have 145 congregations and over 170,000 baptized Lutherans in our Synod alone. It's wild numbers, right? But that's a lot of people, and it's a lot of power. When we talk about people and power and organizing, they're oftentimes the same thing because we do a lot of work with elected officials. And as Christians, as Lutherans, it's actually really a huge part of my understanding, I guess, of what it means to be Lutheran, what it means to be Christian. Because if you read the New Testament, Jesus was an organizer, right?
Jesus was an organizer?
Jesus was an organizer. He was pretty radical. He was always caring about the oppressed people, and that's what he's asked us to do, countless times in the Bible. And to me, that means let's do that. Let's lift up the community and the voices that don't always get heard, and make sure that they are, and that they get a say in making sure that everybody has a just livelihood, a just life.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think Matthew 25 comes to mind with all of the times Jesus says, well, when were you sick? When were you left in prison and you visited me? When did we see you hungry, Jesus, and not feed you? And Jesus answers, anytime you did any of these things for the least of these, or anytime you didn't do these things for the least of these, you did or did not do them for me. And so I think that's a really important part of what it means to be a Christian person and what it means to be involved and to be doing Jesus' will. So I think that's a great example of how Jesus does organizing. And Jesus has this amazing ability to do organizing across centuries of time, right?
That's so true.
And can you tell us a little bit more about why this is important to you as a Christian? Why maybe you got involved in organizing and how you got involved with the Synod?
Yeah, so I grew up in a really diverse neighborhood, and I come from a multicultural, multiracial family. And so I always had an understanding or an experience around race and that kind of thing, and justice regarding race. And when I went to college, like, there was kind of this spirit of activism that was activated as I was in like women's and gender studies. We did a lot of intersectional feminism work, and so my original plan when I went to college was actually to become a fiction editor. I really wanted to just read books all day and tell people how to do things. That was kind of the goal. But when I finished college, it was like, I got to do something in this world that matters, that makes a difference in the lives of the people that I love the most. So I came back, and the place for me that was home was my church, which is Salem Lutheran in North Minneaplis. And so I kind of threw myself into doing work there, and through knowing some of the right people and getting several of the right trainings, I was able to fit in just right in the spot for the racial justice organizer at the Synod. And for me, the work is both personal, right? Like I mentioned, I have a lot of personal stake in racial justice, but also because I think when I was growing up in the church and I was doing confirmation and all the things, I always felt really drawn to like the community of church, but I always felt like there was a little piece of something that wasn't quite there for me, right? We would do service projects and stuff like that, but how was I changing the world with this one little thing, right? I wanted to do something bigger and I didn't know how to do it. And then with my education and then with the trainings that I received coming back, I was able to kind of put that together. And now I really feel like I'm doing the work that I was called to do, right? It feels, it's a vocation for me. That's how it feels.
That's great. I love the fact that you use the word vocation. I think that's really important for us as Christians to understand that vocation is more than just being a pastor in a church. That vocation can really be finding your purpose wherever you're at, in whatever profession you're doing, in whatever you're pursuing. So I think that's a great example for everybody who might be listening or watching this to kind of understand that they can be finding their vocation right where they are in serving God, right where they are and doing exactly what they're doing, right?
Right, absolutely.
In our gospel reading, it talks about it's not what goes into the mouth that defiles, but what comes out of the mouth that defiles a person. That what comes out of your mouth is what comes out of your heart. And so as you're speaking about vocation, as we're speaking about vocation together, how do you see people's passions come through in the midst of organizing? How do you see what comes from people's hearts come out in the work that you do?
Yeah, so one of the tools of organizing is what we call one-on-ones, and it's where we have a very intentional conversation. It's more than, two friends just hanging out, or even just like two new business associates meeting for the first time. It's a very intentional, deep conversation. It feels almost one-sided when it's happening, but it's an opportunity to really learn about a person and discover those passions. And one of the things that we say when we're doing a one-on-one is to pay attention to that moment when somebody lights up. Sure. And that's kind of a place usually in a conversation where you want to push a little bit harder and try to go a little bit deeper, and see what people are willing to share about themselves, that the things that matter. So I think it's really important to listen to what people have to say, but it's also really important to understand the meaning behind some of it too, right? So when someone says that they care about racial justice, but why, right? You want to ask that deeper question of why, and go a little bit deeper.
Yeah, so you mentioned that you have a heart for racial justice and that you have some skin in the game. Where does that fall for you, and why is it that you're so passionate about doing this work?
I mean, part of it I think was honestly being raised in North Minneapolis in a Lutheran congregation. I mean, that was a big part of it for sure, but also, you know, like I said, my family is multiracial. My dad is Ho-Chunk. He's an indigenous person, and my mother is of German descent. My husband is Black, and my little brothers and sisters who are adopted are all Native and Latino. So my family is very mixed up racially, and I grew up very mixed culture. So I spent time, you know, on the reservation in Nebraska with my dad and grandparents and stuff. And so, you know, I have different understandings of the world sometimes. And I think one thing that was always hard for me is to have one part of myself be fully accepted in society, because I pass most of the time, right? So
what do you mean by pass?
That I present as white, so people wouldn't look at me and say, "Oh, she's Native," right? Sure. I think that sometimes, if you're in the right context, people would say that. My last name is Blackhawk, so that usually tips people off. But, but for the most part, I pass. So that part of like my culture and the way that I've experienced the world is fully accepted, where this other and really important part of how I identify and see myself isn't. And I think that rings true for my little siblings, my father, my husband, and so many of the other people that I love in this world. So it is really personal, and it is really important. But knowing that I've felt those kinds of struggles and I'm only mixed, and to know that there are people in this society who are, you know, even more oppressed than I am, because it's a real privilege to pass. And to know that they don't have always those same opportunities, or, you know, the system works against them in a harder fashion. I want to prevent that from happening, because my little bit of struggle that I've gone through is bad enough, and to know that other people have it so much worse, it's not right.
So where have you seen this, where have you seen examples of life being more difficult for your relatives? Where have you experienced the most oppression or watched it take formation in and through the world?
I mean, it's in so much of everything. One thing that's been personal for me lately has been the fight around mascots. I've gotten into so many arguments with folks about Native mascots, and they're just offensive. There's no way around them being offensive. And as an Indigenous person, I'm telling you, it is offensive. So no matter what you say, whatever your opinion is, it doesn't matter because it is offensive. And that's a hard argument for a lot of people. And so that's just one little thing, right? But there's so many other things that are life-threatening. You know, one thing that is really grounding for me in my relationship with my husband is that he's always reminding me of my privilege, which is really good. I need that. But recently, the taillight on one of our cars that I was driving fell out. It was already in bad disrepair, whatever. Fell out. I didn't even notice it fell out. I don't check those kinds of things. I don't think about it.
Sure.
And Chris came home and he saw it and he says, "Brenda, how did this fall? How did this happen? How did this fall out and you didn't even notice?" And he was upset, and I didn't really understand. I'm like, "Well, it's not a big deal. We just fix it." And he's like, "But I could have been driving the car. I could have been the one who got stopped by the police or something. You didn't even think of that." And I didn't. And that's a piece of privilege that I have that I need to acknowledge. And his experience in life is so different that he, you know, walks around the car and checks it before he drives off in it.
Sure.
And it's just it's different. And so to have those kinds of moments in my own personal life and my experience is really important for me, developmentally, but also to keep me grounded in why I do the work that I do. I guess I'd like to explain a little bit about white privilege and what that means.
Absolutely.
So white privilege has no standing on how hard you've worked in your life, right? You can be Black, or you can be Asian, or you can be Native, or you can be white, and you can work really hard your whole life. The thing with white privilege is you don't have to do that while being Black, or you don't have to do that while being Asian, or while being Native, right? There's certain stereotypes, there's certain systems that work against you just because of the color of your skin that has nothing to do with how hard you work. They're really intersectional. They work together, right?
Yeah.
But
so
they
they're
are
not mutually
different.
exclusive, is what you're saying.
Exactly.
So you can, even if you're a white person who works really, really hard, you still have a certain amount of privilege just because of the color of your skin that a person who is Black, who is working the same job, who's working just as hard, would not get those same benefits.
Yeah, I don't even know that benefits is the right word, right? Like it's very systemic. So kind of like the story that I just shared about my husband's experience.
Correct.
Right? So
Yeah.
if say my husband and I work the same job and we drive to work on the same route every day and we both work really hard, he might get pulled over and be late to work one day because he got pulled over, and he'll get docked on his whatever, right? Like so that it's a domino effect almost, right? And then there's other things too. You can really go back in history and look systemically. My husband's grandfather is a Vietnam War vet. And when he came back from the war, he should have gotten, like VA benefits, and he should have been able to get a house, the GI Bill. And he was never able to do that because he was Black. They were kept specifically out of that. And so the generational wealth that is built up in a lot of white families where they had grandparents or somebody who came back from the war and was able to get a house, right?
Right.
Those don't happen for Black folks and that kind of thing, right? So there's certain barriers that exist solely because of race. That's the difference between white privilege and, economic privilege or those kinds of things. It's one thing for my husband to be pulled over and be late for work or whatnot, but it's a risk for his life because as a Black person, he's viewed as a threat. As a Black man, he's viewed as a threat. And so a situation could easily escalate. I don't want to use bad language. My husband has a real smart mouth. It's one of my favorite things about him. But in a situation where the police are involved, that smart mouth could get him into a lot of trouble. He could be viewed as even more of a threat, and it could be life or death for him. If the police pull him over, it's not just a ticket or a warning. It's life or death, and I think that that's a huge thing that people miss out on.
So, as a Synod organizer and St. John's being part of the Synod, what's a way that St. John's can continue to be involved, that we can continue to work for racial justice within the Synod?
So congregations can use organizing in so many different ways. Organizing, the root of it is really to get to know your community and on personal levels, to identify leaders and lift up those voices, right? If that's the base of organizing. From there, you can branch out and do different things. You could identify a direct service that people need in the community. I can think of an example. So Holy Trinity Lutheran Church in South Minneaplis has been doing organizing for many years. And in conversations with their community, they identified predatory payday lending as a major issue for their community. And so what they did is they started organizing to pass legislation to cap payday loans at 36%. That's a direct action. But they also did a direct service, and they established an organization called Exodus Lending, which if you have a payday loan, you can go to Exodus Lending and they will pay off your payday loan, and you can pay back at no interest the loan instead, right?
Wow.
So you're not caught in that debt trap.
Right.
So they provide a direct service and they provide a direct action through using community organizing to identify the issue. So community organizing is really just a good way to build community relationship and identify the things that matter to the people in your community.
We've been fortunate enough to have some of these direct action pieces come and knock on our doorstep. We've had Shakopee Community Assistance and Loaves and Fishes all show up here, as well as the Beacon Housing Initiative. And so we have actually a lot of ways that our members can step up and start to get involved. And I think that finding their passion, we're giving them an opportunity to find their passion, right? And I think that's one of the great things about having this diversity of direct service options, is that they can get involved if they're really passionate about housing, if they're really passionate about feeding people and making sure that people are fed well. And I think that's just such a great opportunity for them. And are there any other opportunities that you see amongst the Synod where people can get involved?
Yeah, can I take a step back and respond to the first part of what you said?
Yeah.
So I think, like you said, there's a good array of direct services provided there. And I wonder what it would look like to take another step towards direct action, which would actually be wondering, how do we get homeless transient youth? How do we get hungry people, how do those things happen? And is there a way for us to go back to where it's happening and say, how can we stop it from happening in the first place?
Right.
Right? And then that would lead to a direct action. That would be a place where you could, call a legislator and say, hey, I want you to support this bill or whatever, right? Like it could be a simple action like that, or it could be inviting, your city councilor or whoever, an elected official to come in and ask them directly and say, hey, is this something that you support or not, and why? And really get people involved in some of the political process as well, and also be trying to stop that initial oppression where it's first starting. So we're not just pulling people out of the river, we're stopping them from being pushed in the first place.
Right. And so as you talk a little bit about what it means to be in contact with elected officials to stop people from getting pushed into the river, right? I think there's a lot of hesitancy on the part of the church in general to be involved in the political process. How do you see the intersection of the political process and the church?
It's great that you're saying this, because the ELCA just put out a new social message that's literally on democracy and discipleship, and how it's important for Lutherans to be politically active. And that can be an array of different things. It's well stated in the statement, or the message. I highly recommend looking it up. But yeah, we're called. Government is, like, the statement kind of goes through and says that government is sacred and important, and here's why, and it lists all the good reasons why. And it's our duty as citizens and as Christians to engage in that process, whether that's through voting, whether that's through, political campaigns, whether it's for running for office, right? There's so many different ways that we engage in the political process, and we're actually called as Christians, and it says in this message why.
So I think one of the really great things here is that we offer people a way to get involved in direct service. How can we move people towards direct action, and how can we stem the problem as opposed to just offering short-term solutions? How can we stop placing band-aids on gaping wounds?
Every congregation has its own context. Every community has its own context and its way of getting there. Traditionally, with community organizing, it would involve, one person who has community organizer training, and that person would, have conversations with lots of different leaders around the congregation and see who has, a passion or a drive for organizing, right? You could send folks to organizer training if you want them to be trained. Otherwise, you can just lead that process. But it would literally just be going through like a choosing an issue checklist and figuring, like, literally just lifting up leaders in your congregation, empowering them to go out into the community, empowering them to raise their voices, and show the rest of the congregation how much this issue matters, and that it's something that as Christians, as Lutherans, that they should care about, right? And then from there, you're headed in the right direction. You just gotta choose the right issue that matters and go that route. And you have at the Synod, you have a staff of organizers who are happy to help you with that process. So if I can be of assistance, and either one of my other organizer coworkers could, we'd be happy to help along with the process. So St. John's, it's time to take the step from direct service to direct action. And I encourage you to reach out to us to start that process.
Well, that's great. Thanks for joining us, Brenda, and thanks everybody for watching our quarantine Q&A.